those poor guys in the first century who were the ones actually reading this as John wrote it. So the Greek word here used, the charagma, is the same used for the stamping of the emperor's likeness on coins. And in fact, you did have faithful Jews in the first century who refused to handle coins. Why? Because they had the face of the guy, emperor, on him, and underneath Dominus et Deus or Divus or whatever. And so to them it was almost a form of idolatry to handle the coin of the reign, which you can imagine how complicated that must have made things, So allowing oneself to be sealed really denotes allegiance. It's a ghastly parody of the sealing of the 144,000, if you remember in chapter 7. And it really, really basically goes to a mark of idolatry and of unbelief. All right? Now, it says also that these faithful are marked for protection. So as the faithful are, us, hopefully, are marked for protection and deliverance, so the unbelievers are marked for plagues and eternal death. And we're going to be seeing more of that later. So the bottom line that is, in order to fit into the system and get ahead, people were being called upon in the first century to worship the beast of emperor worship so that they could engage in trade and handle the coins and be normal people, like their families were kept telling them to do. So how does that apply to us today? We called by people we know, families, friends, to choke it back a little bit, that this religious stuff is just getting a bit too much, and do you have to keep going, and how many times can you go to Mass in 1 week anyway? And can't you read a trashy novel every once in a while? So, I'm kidding, but
No, you're not.
well, in some ways I'm kidding, but think about the emperor worship certificate, in which you could not engage in karma. What would we have done? Okay, let me just talk about this. This calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon the number of the beast. For it is a human number. Its number is? 666. How many times have we seen this darn number? And everybody has their own take on it, and there's a whole horror novel industry, all spawned off that. But I mean, how many people really understand the way that John meant for it to be? It's a lot more tame of an interpretation. Poor John, if he'd known, what we would have made of this number. I don't think he had any of that stuff in mind. But basically, he's speaking of a number which is the opposite of 777. Okay, 777 is what? Perfection cubed. And so 666 is what? Imperfection cubed. So it has to do with humanity's shortcomings, imperfections, incompletions. Solomon, who started out good but didn't end up so well, received 666 talents of gold. That was bad. He wasn't supposed to be receiving gold like that. And yet he did. 666, imperfect number. Nebuchadnezzar erected a statue of himself to be worshipped, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. So you have this idea throughout the Old Testament especially of the 6 number representing imperfection, humanity. You also have to look into the Hebrew and Roman practice of the gematria, which was assigning a numerical value to letters and therefore coming up with names. And you have very early examples. For example, in one of the villas in Pompeii, you see a little inscription where instead of writing, Bobby loves Susie, he wrote, I love her whose number is 545. Okay? Jupiter, the god Jupiter's number was 717. And all the emperors, too, had numerical values. Of course, 666 could also, when summed up according to the gematria, be the name for the emperor, Kaiser Nero, for Nero. Okay? But that's just one interpretation of this number. So we have this whole idea of the Antichrist. I only have a little bit of time to tell you about him, but, that's really all he deserves. Because the Antichrist is really more of a spirit than a person. The spirit of the Antichrist is basically the spirit throughout the ages that comes straight from the pit of hell that says, that opposes itself to Christ. That it says, this Jesus stuff isn't all it's jacked up to be. Let's go home. who says, who is really at the root of the materialistic, secular, humanistic system, of any system that is opposed to God. That is the spirit of the Antichrist. You may have seen it interpreted, it may be expressed in world leaders. You know what, maybe? And eventually, Paul speaks about the man of lawlessness. If you go to, I think it's 2 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul talks about how the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, will come. Jesus himself speaks about him. John in 2 John 1 speaks about the deceiver and the Antichrist. And also we believe as a church that before the end of time there will be a heightened period of tribulation and trials, and that there will be a stronger personification, concentration of all these Antichrist spirit like qualities, maybe in one individual or in a world system or in a series of individuals. Okay? But from that, we can't take it and run. Okay? I don't think John meant for us to be trying to read the morning news and trying to guess who's the Antichrist. And I say that because there's lots of people who do.